Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining us today to hear all about our research findings from our recent research Spotlight on the Employee Engagement Profession. Hot off the press for you today. My name's Emma Bridger and I am MD at People Lab, and I'm going to share with you some really interesting findings from this research. Before I get stuck into the detail though, a couple of points to make. First of all, you can ask questions as we go through the webinar. You'll see a little box underneath the slides that enable you to write down any questions that you've got. And what we will do is we're going to collate all the questions at the end of the webinar and get back to you all with the answers, and also we're going to blog on that as well. And the other thing I'd like to say is that we will be sending all of you a copy of the white paper at the end of the webinar as well. So let's get started. So what we're going to cover today, first of all, is the background to the research. Then going to pick out a few of the kind of key results for you. All of the results are in the white paper in full, but we're just going to pick out a few of the kind of headlines today that we thought were particularly interesting to share with you. Going to talk about some recommendations and some implications as well. And as I said, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions as we go through the webinar. So, the employee engagement gap. So, this research really started with a kind of a question, which was why, with all this extra focus, this increased focus on employee engagement, everybody's talking about it, there's lots of research on it, why are we still not seeing the improvements we'd like to see? So a couple of kind of stats up there for you. So HR Review reported that the HR elite, whoever they might be, are spending at least 15% of their time on engagement a week. And Deloitte's 2015 Human Capital Trends report says that culture and engagement are the most important challenge, and yet we're seeing very little improvement. So the CIPD Employee Engagement Index for 2015 is at 39%, which isn't great really, and that's up just 1% from the previous year. So despite this increased focus, we're not really seeing improvements. And we wanted to find out why that was the case. So our question was, we wanted to explore why is there this gap between this increased focus and yet a lack of any real improvement. Okay, so just to give you a bit of an overview as to who we spoke to, we've got the demographic data in full in the white paper, but just to give you a flavour, we had 75 different organisations take part in the research, which is great for a first run of this, the majority of which are HQ'd in the UK, although we did have people from around the globe get involved in the survey. We had a real diverse mix of sectors represented, so public, private, not-for-profit, finance through to healthcare, and pretty much everything in between. And quite a number had 5,000 or more employees. So just gives you a bit of a flavour of the sorts of companies we were speaking to. But as I said, check out the full white paper for full demographic details as to who took part. And the results are in, so now the really interesting bit. Well, we think it's really interesting anyway. So it had some fascinating results. The picture, in terms of why we see this gap, became clear very quickly. So I've just pulled out a few of the headlines here. So what we found was only 41% of organisations are required, or only 41% of practitioners within organisations, I should say, are required to demonstrate return on investment from engagement. So over half, so there's no demand for them to do that. 53% don't measure impact, less than half have a strategy, and just a quarter have a definition of engagement. So straight away, we're really starting to build up a picture of why this gap might be occurring. I'm just going to delve into one of those areas a little bit more. I'm going to pick on engagement definitions. So this is something that I run a lot of training, a lot of workshops, and this is something that people really continue to struggle with. And we found that of even those companies that do have a definition, 25% of them that have a definition, even of those companies, only 14% say that the definition is well understood. 33% say it's misunderstood, and 37% say they don't know if the definition is well understood or not. So there's a lot of confusion to start with over definitions and whether they're even understood in the organisation. So the picture starts to become clear in terms of why we see this gap. Ultimately, you can't measure what you don't know. If we can't define engagement to begin with, then how can we really build a strategy around it? How can we measure it? How can we show our impact? How can we show return on investment? So it really starts with kind of getting on the same page in terms of what we mean by employee engagement. One of the questions we asked was, okay, so what is it people are actually doing when it comes to engagement? And we decided to use the Engage for Success Enablers model, quite a useful way of looking at what sort of activities practitioners are spending their time on. No surprise there that the top rated enabler was line managers. 71% say they're focusing on line managers. 62% on employee voice, 14% on strategic narrative, and 32% on integrity. So the enablers are kind of, being well used, I think, in some areas and well understood, and line managers being the top enabler that practitioners are focusing on. So no surprise there, really. And it seems that managers are still being cited as a barrier to improving engagement. Practitioners are saying that around 48% of their managers don't have a good understanding of engagement, which we felt was probably a fairly true picture, but we kind of challenged that in terms of, is it really a surprise that managers don't understand engagement when actually practitioners don't seem to either, or at least some practitioners don't either. But if we're struggling to define engagement as a profession, as a sector, then how can we really expect our managers to understand what we mean by engagement? And leadership remains a top priority for companies focusing on engagement. And lots of different areas of leadership in terms of making the case to leaders, getting buy-in from leaders, encouraging leadership visibility, and having leaders role model what great engagement looks like. So lots of focus on managers, lots of focus on the leaders. And we wanted to look at what other sorts of activities those practitioners who are responsible for engagement are focusing on. So what are their other priorities? And there's quite an interesting split here between the kind of the comms side and the more sort of HR stroke OD stroke people side. So almost kind of 3/4 say they develop strategy, i.e. engagement strategy, and look after annual survey. So no surprise there. But 81% said they also have to focus on internal comms, and 79% they do some training development, and 74% some leadership development. So really interesting to see the split of focus in terms of other priorities for those people who look after engagement. And I want to just pick out one of the interesting findings here. So there was lots of kind of feedback in the survey around engagement or communication. Lots of debate around, which comes first, engagement or communication. Are they the same thing? Are they a different thing? And I thought this was really interesting that 68% of companies that responded to the survey said one of their goals of engagement is to improve employee engagement. Sorry, one of their goals is to improve internal communication through employee engagement. Sorry, I'll get there in the end. But I thought this was really, really interesting because to my mind, that's the wrong way around. And I think this probably links back to some of the confusion over definition. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing here, but to my mind, internal comms is a fantastic driver, a fantastic tool, ultimately to improve engagement, not the other way around. So I'd be really interested to get feedback from you in terms of what you think about that. Do you agree? Do you disagree? It'd be great to get some debate going on that. And I should just point out, we've got the hashtag spotlight on, so perhaps we can get some debate going on Twitter in terms of which comes first, engagement or communication, which one should be driving the other, or does it even matter? And actually, one of the interesting findings that may explain why there is this confusion relates to who has responsibility for employee engagement. And you'll see from that graph there that overwhelmingly, engagement seems to sit more often than not in internal comms. Kind of equal split between HR and employee engagement, and then there are other as well, and there are all sorts of weird and wonderful places where engagement sits in organisations, from reward through to employee relations, all sorts of different places. But interesting that comms comes out as kind of the top place where engagement sits, and I think that might explain what we talked about on the previous slide. But again, interested to get your views on that. We couldn't talk about the employee engagement profession without talking about the staff survey. So obviously the staff survey is alive and well and kicking. And of those responding to our survey, 3/4 said they conduct a regular employee engagement survey, so no surprises there. Of those that do, 80% run it annually. The other 20% were sort of split between doing it less and doing it more. But interestingly, almost 1/5 said they don't believe the survey helps them to improve engagement. And the primary reason for this was the results disappear into a black hole. So for those of you that are familiar with the concepts of transactional and transformational engagement, it seems the transactional kind of tick box, we do a survey, nothing really happens with the results, is kind of still happening in quite a few organisations. Okay, building capability. So we wanted to find out how companies, organisations were really supporting and developing practitioners. And for me, this was a fascinating slide. So it seems that most of you that work in engagement kind of get your experience on the job. There's a lot of great experience out there. So 41% say they've been working in it for more than 5 years, 40% more than, well, between 2 and 5 years, and yet 3/4 of you are saying that you don't receive any formal employee engagement skills training. So again, if we go back to that gap that we talked about earlier, is it any wonder that we're struggling to see improvements when we're not really building skills and capability in this area? And engagement isn't something that you can just kind of know. You have it's quite complex. There's a lot of psychology in there. You have to understand what motivates people. You often have to be a great researcher. You have to do a bit of L&D. It's quite a big ask of people. It's what makes it really interesting. But equally, I think organisations are really letting practitioners down by not investing in developing their skills and capability. So a clear action here coming from this finding, I think. We asked about strengths. We wanted to know what's working well. And we've got a number of items that came out of that. There wasn't really any consensus. Lots of different companies are doing lots of different things well. So we talked about areas such as developing the case, change communication, wellbeing, the survey, all sorts of things you'd expect to see in there, but not really any consensus. But there was a lot of consensus when we asked about the barriers, and 4 key things came out. The first barrier cited by those responding to the survey was getting buy-in. So lots of people talked about kind of matching the say and the do. So yes, organisations are talking about engagement, they're saying it's important, but they were struggling to get any real buy-in. And that probably links the lack of resource. So whether it's time, budget, team, lots of people saying they really struggle to get the necessary resource to really kind of move the dial on engagement. Lack of understanding, so practitioners saying there's a lack of understanding generally in organisations as to what we mean by engagement, and then line managers, poor old line managers again being cited as a barrier to really moving the dial on engagement. I'm just going to pick up one of the barriers, the budget barrier. It's always really interesting to find out how much people are spending on engagement. And again, a pretty clear picture here. So, just over 1/4 have no budget for engagement. So, you have to kind of question as to, again, the say-do. Are those organisations really committed to improving engagement if there's not any budget for it? And 21% had less than 10 grand. Lucky 29% had between 10 and 100k, and almost 1/4 had more than 100k. So really quite spread throughout those budget categories there. But of course, we'd argue that great engagement delivers a return on investment. So kind of comes back to that need to demonstrate return on investment to help you get the budget in the first place. So in a nutshell, I'm just going to kind of draw this to some conclusions now. What have we found? So as I said at the beginning, the picture became quite clear quite quickly. So what we found are that companies know engaged employees are critical for business success, but we don't really know what we mean by an engagement in organisations often. And we find that people don't have a strategy and a plan very often. And there's confusion about where engagement should sit and what it is it needs to do. And of course, there's the issue around budget and time, and investing in skills and expertise. So for me, it kind of brings about the conclusion that is it any wonder why things aren't improving when you look at that picture above? It doesn't really paint a very pretty picture. So in terms of recommendations, so as I said, we set out to understand why there's a gap between the increased focus and subsequent performance. And I think the findings are very clear in terms of what we need to focus on and what we need to do next. And the white paper goes into further detail around these, but at a high level, these are our kind of call to action, really. So first of all, a definition. It's a tricky one, this, because we know there's no universally agreed definition of engagement. There are many out there to choose from, 50 plus and counting, I think. But for me, this gives companies a great opportunity to start with a dialogue around what do we mean by engagement. And it doesn't, well, to some extent, it doesn't really matter as long as everybody has the same understanding and we're all clear in an organisation in terms of what we mean when we talk about engagement and what it means to us. We're talking about invest for success. So clearly we need to invest in employee engagement. That's in terms of budget allocation, in terms of time, in terms of skills. We need some investment. If we're serious about this, if companies are serious about it, then there has to be an investment case made. And it comes back to that kind of lack of integrity between what companies are saying and what they're doing. So they're saying, yes, it's really important, it's a real big challenge, but they're not prepared to invest in it. The third point, start with the end in mind. So for me, this is all about the kind of strategy and aligning engagement with business strategy. It starts with saying, for what purpose? Why do we need engaged employees? What is it going to deliver for the company? What will engaged employees do for us? So yes, it might be great to make the best companies top 100 or to get Investors in People gold, but why? What's that going to do for your organisation? The fourth point, kind of a real passion of mine, is about developing experts. I think it's really important that we start to put some real thought and investment into giving practitioners the skills and expertise they need to do this job properly. You know, they're all learning on the job, and you know, there are various books out there and there are courses out there, but we really need to put some time and energy into how we develop true experts. No surprises that unlocking the leadership barrier comes out in terms of recommendations. We need to really focus on what engaged leadership looks like, and again, invest in giving leaders the skills and capabilities to do this properly and do this effectively. And I think the last point is about kind of having some further debate around engagement versus internal comms, and really kind of understanding that these are not the same things. They absolutely go hand in hand, but they're not the same thing. And what do we mean by engagement? What do we mean by internal comms? And how do we want them to work together? So those are our 6 recommendations. As I said, you can read more about them in the white paper. So coming towards the end of our webinar now, if you've got any questions, please do pop them into the little box underneath the slides. We'll be really, really happy to answer them. And in terms of what happens next, we would really like to continue the debate and discussion. So as I said, we've got the hashtag Spotlight on, which you can get involved on Twitter at PeopleLab, our Twitter handle, and we can start to have a conversation about these results. We'd love to continue the conversation. And I would be really interested to find out what you think about these findings, what you think about the results. Are they a surprise to you? Are they exactly what you'd expect? And what are your thoughts in terms of how we can move this forward? So how can we use these findings to really start to improve employee engagement? Because I think in the UK, at least 39% isn't great. With all this focus on it, it should be better. So I'd love to get you involved in the debate. So forward your questions, get involved with the hashtag, and get involved and let us know what you think. So just to finish up then, thank you very much for your time today. I hope it's been useful. As I said, we will be sending you a copy of the white paper. They're all our contact details, my contact details there if you'd like to get in touch. And yeah, enjoy the white paper, and I look forward to hearing what you think about it. So have a great day, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for listening.